Before anyone noticed the weathered suitcase sitting beside the old bus stop, the dog had already decided that no one would touch it. Every time a stranger stepped within a few feet, the medium-sized golden mixed breed silently moved between them and the faded brown case, planting all four paws on the cracked sidewalk without barking, without growling, and without taking his eyes off the stranger for even a second. It wasn't aggression that unsettled people. It was determination. The suitcase looked ordinary enough, its leather peeling at the corners, one rusted buckle hanging loose as if it had been abandoned for years, yet the dog treated it as though the entire world depended on keeping it exactly where it was. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. By sunrise on the third morning, commuters passing through the quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Grove Station had started talking about the mysterious dog. A waitress from the nearby diner left him a paper tray filled with scrambled eggs and bacon. He hurried over, swallowed only a few bites, then trotted straight back to the suitcase before anyone else could approach it. A delivery driver tossed him fresh water. He drank just enough to keep going, never turning his back on the old case for longer than a heartbeat. Even children who usually loved greeting friendly dogs sensed something was different. The animal wasn't asking for help. He wasn't lost. He was waiting for something no one else could see. By mid-morning, dozens of people had recorded videos, and within hours the clips spread across local social media. Some insisted the suitcase probably contained forgotten valuables. Others joked that the dog had claimed it as his bed. A few grew uneasy, wondering why an animal would ignore food, comfort, and attention just to guard an object that nobody wanted. As rumors multiplied, so did the crowd. The noise never seemed to distract the dog. His amber eyes remained fixed on the suitcase, then occasionally drifted toward the empty road stretching east, as though expecting someone who never arrived. When Officer Mason Brooks received the dispatch, he assumed it would be another harmless call about a stray animal. But the moment he stepped out of his patrol SUV, the atmosphere felt strangely tense. The crowd instinctively moved back, leaving only the dog and the battered suitcase standing alone beneath the flickering bus stop light. Mason crouched several yards away and softly called to the dog. The animal glanced at him for the first time, his tail giving one slow, uncertain sweep across the pavement before he immediately returned to his position beside the suitcase. It was almost as if he understood the uniform, yet still refused to surrender whatever responsibility he believed rested inside that forgotten piece of luggage. Mason took one cautious step closer. The dog didn't bark. He simply stepped forward at exactly the same moment, blocking the path with calm, unwavering resolve. Then, just as the crowd fell completely silent, the dog lifted his head toward the distant road, let out one long, trembling whine unlike anything anyone there had heard before, and froze as the sound of another police cruiser approached from around the corner. Officer Mason Brooks slowly lowered his hand, sensing that forcing the situation would only frighten the exhausted dog even more. Instead of reaching for the suitcase, he quietly asked everyone to step back, creating a wide circle of empty space around the bus stop. The change was almost immediate. The dog finally relaxed enough to sit beside the worn suitcase, although his body never drifted more than a few inches away from it. His ribs were faintly visible beneath his dusty golden coat, and patches of dried mud clung to his legs as though he had traveled a long distance without stopping. A volunteer from the local animal shelter arrived carrying fresh food, clean water, and a soft blanket. She knelt several yards away, speaking in the gentle tone she used with frightened rescue animals. The dog washed her carefully before walking over to the bowl. Once again, he ate only enough to quiet his hunger, drank a few careful mouthfuls, then picked up the edge of the blanket with his teeth and dragged it back beside the old suitcase. Instead of lying on the blanket, he carefully spread it over part of the suitcase as though trying to protect it from the afternoon sun. The small gesture left several people speechless. It did not look like an animal guarding property. It looked like someone caring for something precious. Mason quietly asked nearby business owners if anyone recognized the dog. A cashier from the convenience store across the street admitted she had noticed him almost a week earlier. At first, she assumed his owner would return within an hour or two. The next morning, he was still there. Then another day passed. Every evening, after the buses stopped running and the sidewalks emptied, security cameras showed him curling tightly against the suitcase before sunrise brought another crowd of strangers. He never wandered farther than a few yards away. He never chased squirrels, accepted rides, or followed people offering kindness. It was as though an invisible line held him there. Detective Olivia Carter arrived shortly afterward, listening more than speaking. She watched the dog for nearly 10 minutes without interrupting his routine. Every few minutes, he lifted his head toward the eastern road, ears standing high as passing engines echoed through the neighborhood. Each time a vehicle approached, hope briefly brightened his tired eyes. Each time it continued past the bus stop without stopping, that tiny spark quietly faded again. Olivia noticed something else that no one had mentioned. The dog was counting on sounds rather than sights. Even when large crowds gathered nearby, he barely reacted. But the distant rumble of certain vehicles made him instantly alert, as if he believed one particular arrival would finally end his lonely watch. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Mason suggested moving the suitcase to the police station for safekeeping. Before anyone touched it, the dog slowly stood, placed one paw against the faded leather, and rested his chin gently on top. There was no growling, no barking, and no sign of anger. Only quiet determination mixed with a sadness so unmistakable that even the officers hesitated. Olivia looked closely at the old leather case, expecting nothing more than cracked straps and faded stitching. Instead, she noticed a narrow strip of fresh dust missing from one corner, as though someone had recently tried to lift the suitcase before setting it back down again. Morning turned into another long day, yet the dog followed a routine that no one could explain. Every 40 or 50 minutes, he would leave the suitcase completely unattended for exactly the amount of time it took him to trot across the street to a faded green mailbox standing beside an old brick building. He never sniffed the trash cans, never searched for food, and never acknowledged the people trying to call him over. Instead, he would quietly sit beside the mailbox for several seconds, listening with intense concentration whenever footsteps echoed nearby. If the approaching person carried letters or wore any kind of delivery uniform, his ears immediately lifted with hope. But as soon as they passed without stopping, he calmly returned to the suitcase, repeating the strange journey over and over again throughout the day. Detective Olivia Carter reviewed security footage from neighboring businesses and discovered that the pattern had continued for several days before anyone had noticed him. Every morning shortly after sunrise, every afternoon, and again shortly before sunset, the dog visited the same mailbox with remarkable precision before returning to his silent watch beside the weathered case. It was almost like following an invisible schedule that only he understood. Officer Mason Brooks admitted he had never seen behavior quite like it. The shelter volunteers suggested the dog might simply associate mail carriers with his former owner, while others believed stress had caused him to develop repetitive habits. None of the explanations fully fit what they were watching. The timing was too exact. The movements were too deliberate. Curious residents began gathering earlier each day just to witness the mysterious routine for themselves. Some sympathized with the lonely animal, while others became increasingly uncomfortable. Rumors spread that the dog was protecting stolen property or reacting to something dangerous hidden inside the suitcase. A few people even insisted the animal seemed too intelligent, as though he understood far more than an ordinary stray should. Despite the growing attention, the dog ignored cameras, voices, and flashing phones. He focused only on the suitcase, the mailbox, and the long stretch of road disappearing toward the eastern edge of town. Late that afternoon, Olivia decided to perform a small experiment. Without touching the suitcase, she asked a public works employee to wheel an empty maintenance cart slowly along the sidewalk toward the bus stop. The moment the cart reached the same distance as the suitcase, the dog did something completely unexpected. Rather than stepping in front of it as before, he rushed past the cart, circled behind it once, then gently nudged it with his shoulder until it rolled several feet away from the suitcase before calmly returning to his original position. He had not tried to attack the object. He had simply redirected it. Mason exchanged a puzzled glance with Olivia. That single action suggested the dog was making decisions, not acting from panic alone. As dusk settled over Cedar Grove Station, the crowd finally began to thin. The dog completed one last trip to the mailbox before returning to the suitcase. This time, however, instead of lying beside it, he carefully placed one paw beneath the worn leather handle and slowly pulled the entire suitcase several inches until it rested directly beneath the flickering bus stop light. Then he stepped back, stared at the illuminated suitcase without making a sound, and refused to let anyone move closer. The suitcase resting beneath the flickering bus stop light changed everything. What had seemed like the lonely routine of an abandoned dog now looked, at least to some people, like the deliberate protection of suspicious property. Within minutes, another patrol vehicle arrived, followed by a city supervisor responsible for keeping public spaces clear of unattended belongings. The growing crowd had become a problem of its own. Parents pulled curious children farther back, commuters complained that the sidewalk was blocked, and several local business owners worried that the strange scene was attracting too much attention. Nobody wanted to believe the dog meant harm, but nobody could explain why he refused to leave the suitcase alone either. Officer Mason Brooks tried to slow the conversation, reminding everyone that the dog had never shown aggression toward a single person. Even so, pressure continued to build. The city supervisor explained that abandoned luggage could not simply remain on public property forever. If no owner appeared, it had to be removed and documented. Detective Olivia Carter remained unusually quiet. Something about the dog's careful decisions still did not fit the theory that he was randomly guarding forgotten belongings. Yet without evidence, she had little reason to argue against procedure. Shelter volunteers prepared a transport crate nearby, believing the exhausted animal deserved medical attention, a warm bed, and proper care. Their intentions were kind, but from the dog's perspective it looked very different. He watched every movement with growing concern, shifting his weight from one paw to another without making a sound. His ears flattened each time someone measured the distance between the suitcase and the waiting patrol vehicle. A young shelter worker slowly approached holding a leash, speaking gently and offering reassuring words. For the first time since Mason had arrived, the dog did not remain beside the suitcase. Instead, he quietly walked several yards away, causing everyone to believe he had finally given up. Relief spread through the crowd. People whispered that perhaps he had accepted help after all. The shelter worker smiled softly and reached for the suitcase, assuming the difficult part was over. At that exact moment, the dog returned at a full sprint. He did not bark. He did not jump. He simply slipped between the worker and the suitcase before lowering himself onto the pavement, wrapping his front legs around the weathered case as though embracing it. The gesture was so unexpected that several people instinctively stopped moving. It did not resemble a territorial animal defending an object. It looked heartbreakingly similar to someone refusing to let go of the last thing that mattered. Even Mason felt a knot form in his chest. Still, rules were rules. The longer the situation continued, the more difficult it became to justify leaving everything untouched. One of the responding officers quietly suggested that emotional attachment could not prevent an official investigation. If the dog truly belonged to someone, taking him to the shelter might be the only realistic way to identify his owner. Olivia glanced once more toward the eastern road, then back at the suitcase beneath the dog's trembling paws. She hesitated, but before she could object, the supervising officer made the decision everyone had been waiting for. The dog would be carefully removed first, and only then would the suitcase be taken into police custody. As two officers slowly prepared to separate the dog from the suitcase, Detective Olivia Carter asked everyone to pause for just a moment. Something continued to bother her, and it had nothing to do with the animal's unusual devotion. It was the suitcase itself. Throughout the day, dozens of people had stood around it, photographed it, pointed at it, and argued about it. Yet the old leather case had remained in exactly the same position until the dog had carefully pulled it beneath the bus stop light. Olivia walked a slow circle around it without touching anything. The brighter light revealed details that had gone unnoticed during the afternoon. The faded leather was worn almost everywhere except for one narrow section of the handle, which looked smoother than the rest, as though it had been held countless times by the same hand over many years. One rusted clasp had also been repaired with ordinary tan sewing thread instead of metal wire, A simple repair someone would make only if replacing the suitcase was never an option. This was not an expensive piece of luggage abandoned without thought. It had clearly belonged to someone who valued it deeply. While everyone else focused on the suitcase, the dog quietly moved a few feet away and began doing something even stranger. He searched the concrete around the bus stop with careful precision until he located a tiny white object no larger than a shirt button. Instead of swallowing it or playing with it, he gently picked it up between his front teeth and carried it directly to Olivia before placing it beside her boot. Then he immediately returned to the suitcase without waiting for praise or attention. Olivia bent down and realized the object was not a button at all. It was a small plastic luggage tag fastener that had snapped apart, the kind commonly used to attach identification cards to travel bags. She examined the weathered suitcase more closely and discovered an empty slot where a missing luggage tag should have been. Someone had removed the identification card, but the tiny plastic connector had somehow fallen unnoticed onto the sidewalk. The discovery sent a chill through her. If the tag had been intentionally removed, then someone had handled the suitcase much more recently than its appearance suggested. Mason noticed Olivia's expression change. She silently handed him the broken fastener before pointing toward the empty tag slot. The supervising officer dismissed it at first, suggesting the tag had probably fallen off years earlier. Olivia quietly shook her head. The broken plastic was still flexible and clean, showing almost none of the cracking or discoloration expected after years of exposure to sun and rain. It simply did not match the age of the battered suitcase. Suddenly, the report from the convenience store cashier echoed in her mind. She had said the dog appeared only about a week ago, not months or years. Those two facts refused to fit together by accident. The dog had not merely stayed with an abandoned suitcase. He had arrived after someone else had already been there. Olivia slowly looked toward the eastern road once again, then back to the silent animal sitting beside the weathered case, as if guarding unfinished business. She closed her notebook without writing another word and calmly told Mason that before anyone moved either the dog or the suitcase, she wanted the entire area examined inch by inch and every nearby surveillance camera reviewed from the previous 7 days. The temporary security perimeter remained in place, while Detective Olivia Carter requested footage from every nearby business facing the intersection. One by one, the recordings began arriving on her tablet. Most showed nothing unusual beyond passing traffic, impatient commuters, and the lonely dog guarding the weathered suitcase. Then a camera mounted above the convenience store revealed something everyone had missed. 7 nights earlier, shortly after 11 o'clock, an older man carrying the same suitcase slowly walked toward the bus stop with the dog happily trotting beside him. The man placed the suitcase beneath the bench, rested one hand gently on the dog's head, and pointed toward the exact spot where the suitcase still rested today. Seconds later, flashing emergency lights appeared at the far end of the street. The camera angle could not show what happened beyond the intersection, but the man immediately looked toward the lights before turning back to the dog. He knelt, smiled faintly, tapped the suitcase twice with his fingertips, then pointed toward the mailbox across the street. The dog watched every movement with complete attention. The man then walked quickly out of the camera frame toward the approaching lights while the dog remained beside the suitcase exactly where he had been told to stay. He never returned. Silence settled over the officers as the recording ended. Mason replayed the final 30 seconds again and again. The dog had not chosen the suitcase by instinct. He had been given a responsibility. Olivia immediately requested reports connected to that night. Minutes later, dispatch located an incident involving an elderly man who had experienced a sudden medical emergency several blocks east of the bus stop before being transported to a regional hospital without identification. Because no identification had been found with him, he had been entered into the system as an unknown patient while investigators attempted to determine his identity. The realization struck everyone at once. The identification had never been with the man because it was almost certainly still inside the suitcase he had intentionally left behind. The dog's strange routine suddenly made perfect sense. His repeated trips to the mailbox were not random behavior. Every day he had been returning to the place where his owner had pointed, faithfully waiting for the message or person he believed would come back. His careful effort to pull the suitcase beneath the bus stop light had not been an act of possession either. As daylight faded, he had simply moved it where anyone searching after dark would be most likely to notice it. Every unusual action that had confused the crowd had actually increased the chances that someone would finally stop, investigate, and help. Mason slowly walked toward the dog and lowered himself onto one knee. This time the dog did not block his path. He quietly stepped aside and rested one paw against the suitcase, as if asking only that the promise be honored. No command had been spoken, yet every officer understood exactly what he meant. Olivia looked from the faithful animal to the worn suitcase that everyone had been so eager to remove and felt the weight of their mistakes settle over the scene. They had spent days believing they were trying to rescue a confused stray when, in truth, the dog had been patiently trying to rescue his owner's identity all along. Not a single person at the bus stop could say a word. No one moved for several long seconds. The same officers who had been preparing to separate the faithful dog from the weathered suitcase now found themselves replaying every strange moment in their minds. The blanket he had carefully pulled over the old leather. The quiet trips to the mailbox. The way he had guided objects away from the suitcase instead of attacking them. Even the decision to drag it beneath the bus stoplight suddenly carried heartbreaking meaning. None of it had been random. None of it had been fear. Every action had been a patient attempt to complete the promise he had made to the only person who had trusted him. Officer Mason Brooks slowly removed his hat without saying a word. The gesture was small, but everyone nearby instinctively fell silent. The shelter volunteers lowered the transport crate they had prepared only minutes earlier. One of them quietly folded the leash back into her pocket, realizing the dog had never needed to be rescued from the suitcase. He had been protecting the one thing that could finally lead people back to his owner. Detective Olivia Carter looked at the animal with entirely different eyes. She remembered how he had placed the broken plastic fastener beside her boot instead of keeping it hidden. He had been trying to show them something from the beginning. They simply had not understood his language. Around them, the crowd changed as well. People who had been recording videos slowly lowered their phones. The waitress from the diner wiped away tears before walking over with another bowl of fresh food. This time she did not place it several feet away. She gently set it beside the suitcase, respecting the invisible boundary the dog had guarded for so many days. The dog glanced at the food, but, just as before, ate only enough to satisfy his hunger before returning to his place beside the worn leather case. His responsibility still came first. Mason quietly sat down on the curb several feet away, making no attempt to approach any closer. After a few minutes, the dog looked toward him, then slowly walked over carrying the folded blanket in his mouth. Without hesitation, he laid it gently beside Mason's boots before returning to the suitcase once again. It was not a request for comfort. It felt like an act of trust, as though the dog had finally decided that someone else was willing to help carry the burden he had carried alone for an entire week. Mason swallowed hard, unable to find the right words. Olivia carefully contacted the regional hospital and requested immediate confirmation regarding the unidentified elderly patient. At the same time, she instructed dispatch to suspend all plans to remove the dog to the shelter. No one would separate him from the suitcase until the investigation was complete and every possible connection had been verified. The shelter staff agreed without hesitation, offering blankets, water, and veterinary support right there at the bus stop instead of transporting him away. As evening settled over Cedar Grove Station once again, the dog quietly resumed his watch beside the suitcase, but this time he was no longer alone. A small circle of officers, volunteers, and neighbors remained nearby, determined that the faithful guardian who had spent days protecting someone else's final request would never have to stand that lonely vigil by himself again. By sunrise the following morning, the lonely bus stop no longer felt forgotten. Instead of treating the weathered suitcase as abandoned property, Officer Mason Brooks arranged for a temporary protective canopy to shield it from the summer sun while investigators continued their work. Yellow evidence markers surrounded the area, not because anyone believed the suitcase itself was dangerous, but because they finally understood it represented someone's unfinished story. Detective Olivia Carter instructed every officer on scene that nothing inside would be disturbed until the unidentified man at the regional hospital could be positively connected to the belongings. For the first time since the dog had appeared, the people around him were no longer trying to separate him from his mission. They were helping him complete it. The neighbors quietly joined in without being asked. The waitress from the diner arrived carrying a fresh bowl of water every few hours, replacing it before it became warm. The convenience store owner rolled out a small battery-powered fan during the hottest part of the afternoon so the dog could rest comfortably beneath the canopy without leaving the suitcase exposed. Someone placed reflective traffic cones farther down the sidewalk to guide pedestrians around the scene instead of forcing them past the faithful guardian. Even passing bus drivers slowed as they approached, allowing passengers to glimpse the remarkable sight before continuing on their routes. News of the dog's loyalty spread throughout Cedar Grove, but something unexpected happened. People stopped gathering for curiosity alone. Many simply came to sit quietly across the street for a few minutes before leaving again, almost as if paying silent respect to a promise that had lasted far longer than anyone realized. The dog noticed every change. His body no longer remained stiff from dawn until dusk. He still rested beside the suitcase, yet the constant tension gradually faded from his shoulders. When Mason arrived each morning, the dog would briefly stand, stretch, and gently tap the pavement once with his tail before settling beside the suitcase again. It was a tiny gesture, but Olivia recognized it immediately. He was no longer asking strangers to stay away. He was acknowledging the people who had finally chosen to stand beside him. Later that afternoon, hospital staff called with encouraging news. The elderly patient had regained enough strength to respond to simple questions, although he remained too weak for a full interview. Investigators now had genuine hope that the identity hidden inside the suitcase would soon reconnect with the man who had entrusted it to his faithful companion. Mason smiled toward the dog but said nothing, understanding that promises were not fulfilled through words alone. As evening settled across Cedar Grove once more, a gentle breeze drifted beneath the canopy, lifting one corner of the blanket the dog had once placed over the suitcase himself. Instead of pulling it back into place, he quietly rested his head upon it, closed his tired eyes for the first peaceful moment anyone had witnessed all week, and fell into a deep, untroubled sleep knowing that at last someone else was guarding the promise with him. 2 days later, the final pieces quietly fell into place. Investigators confirmed the elderly man recovering at the regional hospital was the rightful owner of the weathered suitcase. Inside were family photographs carefully labeled over decades, handwritten letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, military service documents, insurance records, and the identification that hospital staff had desperately needed from the very beginning. Nothing inside was valuable in the ordinary sense. Yet together those simple belongings restored a name, a history, and a lifetime that had almost disappeared into paperwork marked as unknown. When Officer Mason Brooks carried the suitcase into the hospital room, the old man rested a trembling hand on its worn leather before looking toward the doorway. The dog had not rushed inside. He quietly waited until Mason stepped aside, almost as if asking permission to finish the promise exactly as it had begun. Only then did he walk across the room at an unhurried pace. The elderly man smiled with tears gathering in his eyes and softly whispered the dog's name for the first time. Buddy gently rested his head against the man's knee and closed his eyes, not with excitement, but with peaceful certainty. His task was finally complete. Detective Olivia Carter remained near the doorway, watching the silent exchange without interrupting. She realized that the greatest act of communication in the entire investigation had happened without a single spoken sentence. Every unusual choice Buddy had made had carried meaning. Every misunderstood action had pointed toward hope instead of danger. Outside the hospital, the story spread throughout Cedar Grove in a different way than anyone expected. The bus stop where Buddy had stood watch for an entire week became known not for mystery, but for patience. Commuters occasionally left fresh flowers near the bench, while children taped handwritten notes to the nearby community bulletin board thanking an unnamed dog for reminding adults to look twice before making quick judgments. The city quietly installed a small bronze plaque beside the shelter where passengers waited each morning. It did not describe an investigation or celebrate a police case. It simply honored the quiet courage of keeping faith when nobody else understood. Mason often stopped there before beginning his shift, and every time he passed the old bus stop, he found himself slowing down without thinking. He no longer saw an ordinary sidewalk or an ordinary suitcase. He remembered that truth sometimes arrives without words, asking only for enough patience to be recognized. As for Buddy, he never returned to guard that corner again. He no longer needed to. Yet whenever the old man visited the bus stop during evening walks, Buddy would pause for a single moment beneath the same light where he had once waited alone, give one gentle sweep of his tail, and continue forward beside the person who had finally found his way back. Some promises are not spoken. They are simply kept.